Well, you get lots of surprises in politics, but this was something else altogether. The Andrews Labor government thumped the coalition in the Victorian election in a manner nobody saw coming. Welcome to Insiders. Well, rarely does a government get re-elected in such a decisive way. We'll go straight to the numbers because they tell the story. Here's the primary vote. The ALP won 43% of the vote, the Coalition just 36% and the Greens 10%. And that translates to a two-party preferred vote of 58 to 42. However, expect that to come down quite sharply as pre-poll votes are counted. Liberal voters voted early. It'll probably be nearer to maybe 55-45, but it's still way beyond what the polls were saying, and it left seasoned Labor figures shaking their heads in astonishment. And so to the state of the lower house, with 71% of the vote counted. Labor is assured of 52 seats in the Assembly, the Coalition 24 and the Greens 2. But there are still 10 seats in doubt and Labor might win 4 or 5 of those. The Premier, Dan Andrews, will join us here in the studio in just a moment. We'll get analysis from the panel, Nikki Saba, David Crowe and Annika Smethurst, and a federal perspective from Labor's employment spokesman, Brendan O'Connor. But first, this is how the leaders reacted last night.
We are the most progressive government in the nation. We are the most progressive state in the nation. Can I make some final remarks about those who today could not see their way clear to support our positive and optimistic plan? We will still govern for you. We will govern for all Victorians.
I want to thank my parliamentary colleagues in the state parliamentary team in the parliament that has now just passed. They have been unified. They have stuck together. They have done what they had to do to stick together and to learn from the mistakes of disunity. Can I say that for the next parliament, as a party, we need to stick together. We need to stay united and we need to stay focused on our opponents and the game ahead, not on ourselves. While tonight is not our night, we know that, we acknowledge that, we accept that. Our time in the sun will come again. Thank you very much.
Premier, good morning. Welcome. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'm sure you expected to win the election, but did you really think a majority like this was in prospect?
Look, I think all Victorians would look at the results and be, well, from our point of view, very pleasantly surprised at the magnitude. But at the same time, we always knew that if we delivered on the commitments that we had made in 2014, if we stayed the course in terms of not being so much focused on the issues that are big on Spring Street, but instead focused on the issues that make a real difference on Main Street in local communities, hospitals, schools, road, rail, jobs, funding, skills and training properly. If we stayed focused on those things and delivered against the commitments we'd made, that we would be rewarded for that. Because I think Victorians and Australians more broadly are sick and tired of governments who say one thing before the election, like no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no cuts to the ABC, and then deliver exactly the opposite afterwards.
But try and explain it, though, to a national audience. It has to go beyond that. I mean, to what extent do you think the other side contributed?
Oh, look, I don't spend a lot of time talking about our political opponents. Matthew Guy very graciously conceded last night. I made some points last night that we had an optimistic and positive plan based on a track record of getting things done and keeping our promises. I'm very pleased that that's been wholeheartedly endorsed. The other point that has to be made is that the low road, the politics of fear, the politics of division, which is not leadership, that has been rejected, and I'm very proud of that.
Do you think, though, that the Liberals would have been better off if Malcolm Turnbull was able to campaign in Victoria?
Oh, well, that'll be for others to judge. I'll let others run commentaries on that.
I think there will be a little...
I'm pretty sure there will be.
Kicking around. Just in retrospect, though, on there were some scandals and the red shirts incident. Are you prepared to say now that you can do better?
Oh, look, every government can always do better. We are always about doing more, getting things done, delivering on the commitments that we made. This is the most progressive state in our nation. Victorians are smart. Victorians have big hearts as well.
How does that manifest itself when you say that?
Well, I think Victorians, there is a generosity of spirit there is a sense that we can never be a stronger state unless we are a fairer state. And I value that. And the Victorian community values people who make commitments and then deliver them, people who regard government and know government to be a precious gift. That means you have to work very hard every single day. They want big, broad, bold politics, not this narrow, nasty stuff that was on offer, and it was rejected comprehensively yesterday.
And when you look at things like the Safe Schools program, the safe injecting rooms, do you think embracing those kind of policies helped you push back against the Greens this time around?
I think embracing policies that work and then getting out and defending the position you've taken. Don't take backward steps, provide leadership. The safe injecting facility saves lives, safe schools saves lives. And we've seen some pretty low road campaigns against both of those initiatives. But again, Victorians, I think, are a lot more generous and a lot smarter than our opponents thought they were.
Do you think federal Labor is now entitled to be a bit more ambitious in terms of the gains that they can make in this state?
Well, look, I know that Bill and his team will put forward an equally positive and optimistic plan, not just for Victoria, but for our entire nation. One that's based on fairness, one that's based on making sure that people have the services that they need today and into the future, the infrastructure they need today and into the future. And I'll be out there campaigning very hard to see Bill Shorten as Australia's next Prime Minister.
But you made gains in some very unlikely places. You can't automatically assume that Bill Shorten can replicate that.
I'm not assuming anything, and I've known Bill a long time, and he'll take nothing for granted. I've never taken anything for granted. We campaigned very hard on a record of delivery, doing the things we said we would do, and with an equally bold and optimistic plan for the future. Bill and his team, I know, I'm absolutely certain, will have not only a positive plan, but they'll take nothing for granted. They'll campaign hard right across the country to get that precious gift, the opportunity not just to defeat our opponents, Barry, but to have the responsibility and the opportunity to make our nation better. That's what Bill's running for, and we'll have to wait and see how things go.
One final question, it has nothing to do with you, but Michael Kroger, the President of the Liberal Party, do you think he will survive this?
Well, as I said, I don't often commentate on our political opponents, but, you know, I think swanning around suburbs you've never been to in your Burberry trench coat, lecturing people about cost of living, people pick fakes, and they pick nasty fakes from a long way off.
I'll take that as a yes.
I hope he's the Liberal Party President for life.
All right, thanks for coming in this morning. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Well, the blame game within the Liberal Party started early, at precisely 8:20 in fact, when Jeff Kennett called on the party's Victorian President, Michael Kroger, to quit.
Michael, if you're listening, it's 8:20 by midnight. I hope your resignation is on the floor. The time is up, quite clearly. This has been a terrible result for the party. Mate, we've been around for a long time. It's time you went. And I think you ought to do the party the service of going.
Well, Jeffrey, Okay, thank you. I've just been re-elected by a record majority a few months ago, Jeff. And
that's been a roaring success.
The thing with Cormac was very important to the party. It didn't make...
That's been a wonderful success.
It has been an enormous success.
All right, go back to the Brack slide, as they called it. It's now the Dan slide, of course, but the Brack slide of 2002, when Labor won 62 seats. What divided the Liberal Party at the time was the Kennett and Kroger factions. They were at war. 16 years later, Nikki, we're getting it again.
Nothing's changed. In fact, if anything's changed, it's got a whole lot worse. And one of the things that people were saying to me before the campaign actually took place, that a big factor in their problems was the legal suit that Kroger had launched against the Cormac Foundation. Now, this not only polarised the Liberal Party because they thought it was a very dumb move, it also deprived the Parliamentary Party of money.
They got the money in the end, but very late.
Too late.
Very late in the piece.
Too late. What they needed was money well in advance to run a mini campaign to try and promote Matthew Guy and his programs. They never had the money to do that, and they blame Kroger for it. Now, what they're saying to me is Kroger has apparently said to people that he is prepared to vacate the position in March, and I suppose that Dan Andrews would be very unhappy about that. But what they want is for Kroger to retire now from the presidency, to allow someone else to get in who can possibly put up a bit of a show for the federal election, because otherwise they're worried the federal election will go the same way as the state election.
David, what are you hearing of the people you've already spoken to on the Liberal side? Are they taking lessons from this?
There are people who are taking lessons from it. I think one of the hard things for some of the Liberals is that they know that some of their colleagues won't heed the lessons. And so there is this divide within the Liberal Party about to what extent do they play on some of these social issues that are marginal, as we saw last night, to some of the voters. We've got a party that does tend to crusade on things like abortion rights in Queensland, on euthanasia sometimes. They still have trouble on climate change, and they want to tell people whether to get married, whether it's okay to get married or not. Now, those kind of people within the Liberal Party are still very much focused on those issues. Will they take a lesson from last night? Some of their colleagues don't think that that's likely.
See, when you raise Queensland, that's part of the difficulty. I mean, listening to Michael Kroger, sometimes you'd think he was talking to a Queensland electorate, not a Victorian electorate,
yeah.
which is progressive. But it seems to me that the Liberals had put together a strategy, and that was to try and save some of those 7 seats in Queensland, because they didn't really think there were a lot of seats to be lost in Victoria, maybe 1 or 2.
This is a big reality check.
We'll come to that in a moment when we show you just now what's in prospect in Victoria. And okay, let's go back to the basics. What happened?
Well, I think this is, as David said, one of the main things is this idea of culture wars, that you can win elections on culture wars. But when we have compulsory voting, you have to lead from the centre, and people want things done. They want things built. And that's what Daniel Andrews did, and that's the agenda he ran. They might not like injecting rooms, or they might not like euthanasia, but to think you could run a whole policy and win government off this.
But to say they might not like injecting rooms, the injecting room is in Richmond. And there was a big swing to Labor in Richmond.
Well, I would question that, obviously this is an endorsement of the Andrews government, so I don't know how much anger there is out there, but this idea that Liberals a certain group of Liberals seem to try and campaign on, and federally we see this, still harping on about same-sex marriage a year after it's been passed and was passed, in National Party seats. So I think that's a big lesson they can take out of it. But to think that there was no federal issues with Malcolm Turnbull, that this had nothing to do with it. Last night we saw a range of MPs saying this is a state issue fought on state issues. It's not. Malcolm Turnbull, everyone knows, was popular in Victoria, and this is... You can't be losing seats like Wentworth, nearly losing Hawthorn, Brighton, Sandringham, Malvern had a 12% swing, and not think that this hasn't got anything to do with the chaos in Canberra.
The thing is that it's not just confined to Victoria. I mean, there are little Victorias spread out around the entire country. Yep. You have Brisbane in Queensland, you have North Sydney as well as Wentworth in New South Wales, you have Boothby in South Australia, Curtin in WA. So it is not just Victoria that's the problem for the Liberal Party these days. The Liberal Party has to try and work out how to speak to its various constituencies in a way that brings them all together. There was this, what unites people in Queensland and what unites people in Victoria. They haven't worked that out. But you can't say one thing in Queensland because it will be heard in Victoria anyway. That's the challenge. That's the challenge. There was this assumption, it hasn't been resolved during the spill, that it would be without ramifications, that there was a need to... Malcolm Turnbull wasn't popular in Queensland and they could do that without any ramifications of Victoria. Federally, the seats, Casey, Latrobe... Well, let's just go through those. Deakin, Aston... Yeah, and we'll have a look at them, because there were 4 seats that certainly Labor had in their sights before this, and Dunkley there is now notionally Labor because of the redistribution, but they had reasonable prospects in all of those. Who knows what will happen in Chisholm if Julia Banks was to stand as an independent. But now, look, this is the list has expanded according to the information I was given last night. Casey, maybe not so much. The Speaker, I think, would have a good chance of holding on. But look at the names there. Michael Sukkar, Greg Hunt, Alan Tudge. Big names.
This is the implications of the August spill. The size of this state result shows that it's not all federal factors, right? A lot of state factors. There's about delivery of infrastructure, and there's a recognition of what Daniel Andrews has done. But those people who were behind the spill in August have to take some responsibility here, not just Michael Kroger, but Greg Hunt, Alan Tudge, Michael Sukkar, Jason Wood. Some of these MPs who were supporting Peter Dutton in August and now looking at their own federal seats being in danger. It's a pretty clear signal for them.
And you can add to that list, they won't lose them, but Higgins and Goldstein. Caulfield has had a huge hit against it. Malvern. These are seats the Liberal Party shouldn't be losing. If you can't convince people in Malvern to vote Liberal, I don't know who will.
And both the Liberals and Nationals are under pressure from independents. Mildura?
Mildura is an interesting one. There is a former deputy mayor running up there, Ali Cupper, I think her name is, and she seems to be in front against the Nationals up there, and it's just a sign of, you know, the future of the National Party getting these challenges from strong independents. And in Morwell, it's an interesting battle there too. Currently, the independent former Nat is ahead.
And in Benambra, a Liberal is under pressure from Jackie Hawkins, a young woman who once worked for Cathy McGowan, so it's the McGowan factor kicking in there, and they're very confident that because the preferences are flowing strongly to her, that she might win that seat. And there's another story from last night that we've got to pass on to you. It's about this guy. His name is Declan Martin. He's 19 years old. He's been a member of the Labor Party now for 2 months. When you're thinking Brighton, think Warringah, Wentworth. It's that kind of seat. He spent in total $1,750 in Brighton, so I think those who hold the money will now be saying that's your template candidates. You can almost get there. Probably won't get there, but here he was last night.
If elected, I'd be the youngest member in history.
So do you have a driver's licence?
Well, I actually joked with Nick, the member for Bentley, just before. He might have to drive me in to Parliament if elected. But
you can carpool. You can catch the train.
Yeah.
So he's in front, but the expectation is postal votes might go against him and he won't quite make it.
But the very fact that that happened in the seat of Brighton says something about the Liberal base, I think. I mean, we've had 3 years of debate in Canberra about who the Liberal base is. Tony Abbott always trying to appeal to the Conservative base. Well, that's a pretty Liberal seat, and they've just sent the Liberals a message. And if Wayne Goss said years ago that the voters had the baseball bats out, well, maybe some of the voters have got the golf clubs out now. For some of the Liberals.
I think that's right. I mean, they talk about the base, but the hard right that talks about the base means the membership, which is a very narrow cross-section of Australia. Well, last night, the Liberal electoral base spoke and they sent a very strong message, and if they ignore that, they're in real trouble.
Declan Martin, by the way, had to go to the party in Bentley in the neighbouring seat because he didn't even think about organising one in his own seat. OK, well, Brendan O'Connor up next. While he joins us, one other talking point last night, a senior Liberal, the Shadow Attorney-General John Pasuto, was live on the ABC panel watching his relatively safe seat at Hawthorn slipping away. He might yet retain it, it's touch and go. But through the night he showed remarkable composure and he had this message for his federal colleagues.
I think the organisation needs to have a good look at just the scale of this, and my own preference would be that the party needs to take urgent action to reorient and get back on the right foot. My advice to our federal colleagues is if you haven't already had enough lessons, you ought to look at Victoria and learn the lessons that we're seeing tonight, even if this result evens out.
Brendan O'Connor, good morning, welcome.
Morning, Barry.
So talking there about lessons for the federal coalition, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Like disunity is death.
Well, that's right. But firstly, we should congratulate Dan Andrews and the Labor team. They did a remarkable job, a stunning victory, repudiating fear and division, but also really doing what they said they'd do, invest in schools, hospitals, public transport, renewables, and as a result, a remarkable, as I say, remarkable victory.
Well, that was Dan Andrews' contribution from your point of view, but what do you think the other side contributed?
Well, look, I think if the federal Liberals think that this is just all about state issues, they're in denial. Clearly, the division, dysfunction, disunity, the civil war within the Liberal Party in Canberra has certainly contributed to the scale of the victory in Victoria yesterday. The fact is that tearing down a Prime Minister has significant costs to any party, and we're seeing that as a result of the efforts by many Victorian federal Liberals too, who of course were the architects of the destruction of Malcolm Turnbull.
Do you think now that federal Labor is entitled to raise its ambitions in Victoria?
Well, we really believe we've got a tough fight. We don't assume anything. I think that the Australian people expect us to present an alternative vision for Australia. and Bill Shorten is focused on that, as of course all of my colleagues, ensuring we can present an alternative vision, whether it's in terms of proper tax reform, standing up for workers, providing a clean energy future, lowering energy prices, but at the same time delivering on what Australians expect us to deliver upon. So I think it's fair to say that certainly it provides confidence for us going into an election, but we take nothing for granted, Barry.
Well, I want to ask you now about some of your portfolio responsibilities, and particularly around wage increases. Now, what is Labor's policy to boost wages going beyond what you've already said on penalty rates?
Well, as it's clear now, I mean, Scott Morrison as Prime Minister and before that as Treasurer has presided over the lowest wage growth in 25 years. It's a real problem in the economy. We will be addressing, in fact, have more to say about some of the ways we'd like to lift wages in this country, and it's something we need to present before the next election. We've already said, as a priority, we'll restore penalty rates, if elected, for 700,000 Australians. We believe the government's support for cutting penalty rates, that's cutting real income for low-paid hospitality and retail workers, was a terrible mistake.
But it'll need to go beyond that.
Of course we do, and that's why we've been already announcing policies about preventing exploitation that happens in the labour market. So just quickly, making sure that labour hire workers are not underpaid, making sure that all workers in the same workplace who are doing the same work get the same pay is something that needs to be dealt with. Making sure that we allow for bargaining, ensuring that we reset the bargaining framework so workers actually can sit at a table and bargain with employers.
But what the trade unions are saying, they want wage deals cut across all industries. Now, are they going to have to be reined back a bit?
Well, we're engaged with employers and indeed the unions about what the future IR framework should be. We need to make sure that the framework is reset, because clearly workers are not getting a fair share of the dividend of economic growth. I mean, it's not just Labor saying that, Barry. The Governor of the Reserve Bank's made clear that wages are flatlining. So what we believe we need to do is ensure that the balance is reset to restore power.
Yeah, but I'm talking about whether that involves
I'll go to
industries.
That.
Because you know, you've got a national conference coming up. They're asking for more than that as well, of course, right of entry changes and so on.
Yes.
What is your message to the trade unions? Do they have to be a little more realistic about these things?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we need to look at enterprise bargaining or collective bargaining. And let's be clear, collective bargaining has been at the centrepiece of Australian law now for 25 years, with one interruption, work choices. So it's been part of delivering, uninterrupted economic growth. However, enterprise bargaining as it currently stands has been falling insofar as outcomes for the labour market. There's been fewer enterprise bargains struck today than was the case some years ago. There's a greater reliance on minimum conditions of employment. So we need to explore what other avenues are needed to enable workers to be empowered to get decent outcomes. And in keeping with that, we're looking at multi-employer bargaining as part of the options.
You might have to tell the unions they can't have everything that they want, right?
Well, we should be looking at a framework that grows our economy, ensures that workers get their fair share. Now, as for the bargaining mechanisms, the Fair Work Act now allows for a multi-employer bargaining, but it hasn't worked. For a decade, it's failed to deliver outcomes for those workers who are covered under that particular provision. So we're absolutely focused on examining the bargaining mechanisms so that there are decent outcomes, whether you be a nurse or, in fact, a childhood educator or an electrician. We need to make sure people get decent outcomes. That's not happening under the current Fair Work regime, and we need to look at that. And we are engaged with the unions and with employers to get a decent outcome.
Okay, and just finally, the New Start allowance, and you get plenty of advice from people that that's inadequate at about $275 a week for a single person. What's your commitment there?
Well, I think we've recognised that it's very hard for people on New Start to live, and it's very hard for people that are on New Start to find work. They just don't have the means by which to prepare themselves for employment, and for that reason, if elected, a shortened Labor government will have a comprehensive review of New Start to make sure
the review doesn't add a cent necessarily.
No, but we've made clear, we recognised already that New Start is too low. When last in government, we enacted increases to the pension and the disability pension, and there was no examination of the relative proportion that was applied to New Start. We think that that needs to be examined, and we've accepted that it is too low for people to find work and it's too low for people to live on. So, of course, we need to work out the fiscal implications, but we do believe it is now time that we do something in this area, and we would hope Scott Morrison would show some heart and concern for those people that are on the margins and work with Labor to do something about it.
Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks, Barry.
I was always quite fascinated by the energy and flow of cities. They have their own rhythms, their own patterns, their own personalities.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison says he will cut immigration numbers to ensure Australia's biggest cities don't become swamped.
The buses and the trains are full. The schools are taking no more enrolments.
It's clogging our roads and public transport. So we do need to scale immigration back. We need to scale it back quite substantially.
Sydney is connected to the rest of the country. It may be news to some Sydney-siders. There are places outside even the 2 kilometre zone. You're looking shocked?
Oh my God, where are we? You got us into this, and I suggest you start thinking about how to get us back.
We're running 30,000 below where it has been, and it wouldn't surprise me if any process that we went through would arrive in that sort of territory.
The people have now spoken up. The debate has happened on this, and the people in general are saying immigration levels are too high.
We don't need to put a handbrake on population growth. We need to manage our population growth sensibly in a country which, quite frankly, can take a lot more than 25 million people.
God, it's a barren, featureless desert out there, isn't it?
The other side's
By cutting permanent migration, what you'd simply do is you put a huge burden on the budget, some $4 to $5 billion. You would also reduce the proportion of your permanent intake that was skilled.
You've got to be flexible. In fact, I think we have footage of the PM being flexible as he announced his new immigration policy.
A significant scale back in immigration is certainly a substantial step in the right direction.
We need to take a breather. I'd like to see the rates halve in New South Wales.
Most of the population growth has been driven by migration in those 2 cities.
The reality is you could stop immigration tomorrow for 5 years and we'd still have congestion.
I think Victoria's population growth is right as a number.
I'm not proposing to cut the total of number of people that come to Victoria.
You can't be serious about migration levels when you don't talk about the 1.6 million people on temporary visas.
There'll be a COAG meeting in December, and then we'll be announcing our full policy early next year.
It never ends, does it? All that space.
All right, so basically what when you cut through it all, what the government's proposing is to reduce permanent immigration by about 30,000 or so. Here's the Prime Minister.
My approach is to actually get away from the top-down discussions about population to set our intake cap and get into a discussion from the bottom up. Now, I believe that this is likely to end up in revising down the permanent migration cap in Australia.
It's quite a radical change to how we'll approach the population problem, acknowledging that we've got the main growth levers at the federal level through the migration lever, but the states and territories have to deliver the services, the infrastructure, the housing, etc. on the ground.
Now that certainly makes sense, but Anna, an interesting thing during the Victorian election was that both the state opposition leader and the Premier said that they like the levels where they are. So this then becomes the pressure pretty much coming from Sydney.
It's an interesting, because Melbourne's growing at a quicker rate, so it is interesting they both ran with that policy. But if you look at Scott Morrison's biggest issue here is authenticity. When we go back to that footage of him in March saying that, as a treasurer, he liked it because it led to growth and more money. It will be a hard argument for the federal government to run. And in putting it on the states, it's smart in some ways because I guess they hope that the infrastructure problems will then be blamed on state governments, but it never will be. This is always going to be seen when you look at migration as a federal issue. and consequently they will always take that on and bear the responsibility. But when you've got other states shouting out for people, such as South Australia, it's more... You can see what they're trying to do. They want to keep them up, the levels high, but send people where they want, and you just can't do that. It's impossible to.
So, David, in the end, it's just you don't go with a one-size-fits-all policy, right? You're adaptable around the country.
And that's the point of the Premier's meeting in December, where they're going to have a discussion about the settings. Now, Scott Morrison's already pretty much declared what the outcome will be at the federal level. He wants the cut of 30,000. That's only in the permanent intake. Remember, there's this net overseas migration, which actually feeds into the population number, and that includes a lot of working holiday makers. It includes more than 500,000 overseas students who are part of the population number. And I think it gets back to the fact that Sydney is the pressure point. It was really interesting, the message from the Victorian leaders during the state campaign. Gladys Berejiklian wants to halve the migrant intake into her state, New South Wales. Now, I think they will have to come forward at this December 10 COAG meeting to outline what they would like to see to make that happen. Now, there are some hard decisions there. Would she want fewer skilled migrants into Sydney? Because that's where some of the jobs are. That's where the employers want people. Would she want fewer overseas students coming into Sydney? Because that then becomes a competitive issue for those universities. Will they go to Melbourne universities instead? These are really tricky decisions, and I think in some ways the onus is on the New South Wales government now to say what they want.
And they've got an election coming up, Nikki.
They do, but look, all this talk, it's really a Clayton's cut, isn't it? The cap was at 160,000, it came in at 130,000, so the new cap is 130,000, which really doesn't change the numbers. So it becomes a question of distribution. And that means trying to get all these people out to regional areas or to states where they're more needed. Now, they can try that, but how do you keep them there? What is the mechanism that is going to keep them there? So I think they haven't resolved that, but I think this issue obviously will kick off the election year next year, so one hopes they might have a clearer idea of the mechanisms by which they make that happen.
When you make the point that they that it really lands at 130 anyway, that for those who think it's going to beat congestion, you're still going to be sitting in your car for about the same amount of time on your way to work.
Well, the other thing
not going to solve the traffic problem.
The other thing about the Clayton's cut, it would probably be 160,000 as a permanent intake, but that means what they're doing at the moment, you can see it in the stats, slower waiting times for spouse visas, more people on bridging visas. They're still in the country, right? They're still on the bus, they're still on the train, but they're not counted as the permanent intake. And that's another aspect of the Clayton's cut.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to energy policy, because Bill Shorten this week put out Labor's policy in the run-up to the election. He put it in a rather profoundly simple way.
The single most important thing about energy and climate policy is to have one.
Okay, so that's a bit of a dig at the other side, but...
Be good to have a good one.
Yeah, well, part of it is the Liberals' policy, the NEG, which went through the party room 3 times. That's part of it, to bring that back. He's also trying to find ways to get around the Parliament as you're implementing some of these policies. Then, of course, there's the batteries, subsidised batteries into the homes, and that's where Scott Morrison chose to go.
What we've got here is we've gone from pink bats to pink batteries. They never learn from their mistakes, the Labor Party. And what we have here is a reheat of the same failed approach to policy that we saw from the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd Labor government of 5 and 6 years ago.
Now, I can get the bats to batteries, that's all nice, that works. Pink, though, the battery's pink.
They're green.
I think they didn't have anywhere to go. They were hoping that Bill Shorten would come out and announce a new version of the carbon tax. And look, they have said they'll split that. So there is further announcements to come, and they've been quite clever in how they've done this. But they had nowhere to go. When you've been out saying the NEG is going to save people $500 all year, and then the opposition party introduces it, they can hardly come out and say, oh, it's not a good idea anymore, and it's gone through your own party rooms. So I guess it was the only option Scott Morrison really had.
Yeah, David, explain how... Sorry, Nikki, I'll come back to you in just a moment, on how they plan to get around parliamentary procedure to get some of this, some of these measures implemented.
Well, they're using the old trick, which both sides have been using for years now, of the off-budget idea, and so they're going to take on another $10 billion in debt with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. In some ways, the batteries are just the lost leader out the front. That's only $200 billion. What they're really talking about is $10 billion in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to invest in new energy generation.
And this doesn't need parliamentary approval?
Well, it already exists and it's got an investment mandate now. So legislatively, it's already set up. You don't have to have an argument in the Senate over what your emission targets are in order to ramp up the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. What you do need is a bill to give it more money. And it's very interesting, I think, that the Greens supported the creation of this. Christine Milne was fully on board with this when Greg Combet was the minister. So they will be saying to the Senate, please vote to expand what you voted for before. And I think that narrows, it doesn't mean that there's no Senate approval of this, but it narrows the scope of the argument in the Senate. It won't be about what the carbon price is, and it won't be about what the emission target is. It'll be about the mechanism to put this big investment into the sector.
Nikki.
Well, just a couple of things there. Firstly, business was only very lukewarm about this idea, partly because they're worried about the implementation, how it might come about. Secondly, I just can't help thinking direct action. This is a very sophisticated version of direct action. And as for bipartisanship on the neg, that could have happened months ago. Labor could have agreed to what Turnbull was putting up, even at the lower targets, and then upped it if and when they got into government. So all this talk now about, you know, you should join with us so we could get on with it, just sounds a bit rich.
I look at the $10 billion, and to me it's the cost of, it's an indictment of the Parliament. The fact that this $10 billion scheme is needed. If there had been a more consistent and settled climate change and energy policy months ago, maybe you wouldn't need $10 billion. And it's an indictment of the Parliament and the inability to get a bipartisan agreement. And it's an indictment of the coalition party room, because I can't think of any source of, isn't it the single biggest source of policy instability on this front?
Yep, has been. All right, let's go on to a few other issues. Now we'll start with Jim Molan. Now Jim Molan is Annika, a high-profile member of the right of the party, and he's been effectively disendorsed.
Yes, yesterday they had the pre-selection in New South Wales and he's dropped down to third position, which actually becomes fourth once you fall in behind a national. So it's an unwinnable position. It's unwinnable at the best of times, let alone in, when the polls are against you. So it's a big hit in New South Wales. There's a bit of controversy about the pre-selection. Apparently there was between 200 and 300 delegates that didn't show up, and I guess the right are saying, calling for sort of saying that there's some sort of issue there. But on the base of it, Holly Hughes got first position and Andrew Bragg is number 2. Now Andrew Bragg was of course going to run in Wentworth and stood aside to do this. Holly Hughes is the interesting case. She was meant to come in to replace Fiona Nash with the citizenship drama. She then couldn't because she was on tribunal and seen as a prophet of the Crown. So her seat then went to Jim Molan and now she's taken it back. So in many ways it's just righting a wrong that happened a little while ago.
Can this be seen as a win for the moderates or a win for women?
It's a win for the... well, it's a win for Holly Hughes, who apparently made a really excellent speech, right, and convinced 520, a majority of the 520.
Hung in there for a long time.
Yeah, so it's harder for the factions to stitch this up because there were 520 people in the room, biggest pre-selection of its kind I think the party's ever had, because they're the democratisation rules that Jim Molan brought in and which he now suffers from. But it's a win for Alex Hawke and the middle right, not the hardcore conservatives.
But I had a sense that Jim Molan had a very strong supporter base within the party.
On the more conservative side. And I think that's, again, it gets to that question of who is the base. Because we're told so often that mainstream conservative side is the base of the party, is the future of the party. Well, among those 520, they voted for Holly Hughes.
Well, Molan and Tony Abbott fought tooth and nail to get this up. It got up and Molan was a victim of it. So I guess the bottom line here is be careful what you wish for.
Now, the embassy issue is still ticking along, and this week it went to a new level with Christopher Fine and Josh Frydenberg having a bit of a go at one another.
Why is this delicate foreign policy decision being played out in public like this? Well, you'll have to ask the people who are making those comments. Fran, I can tell you there is a process in place. It's the right process to determine whether the Australian embassy should be in the capital of Israel, which is West Jerusalem. Now, if the shoe was on the other foot, it would be like Israel saying that they intend to put their embassy in Sydney and pretend that Canberra isn't our capital.
Chris has been giving his opinion freely on this matter for quite a while, so I don't know what got into his Wheaties this morning. Chris is his own person.
Oh yes, he's quite unique. He's quite unique.
And we'll leave him to be a legend in his own lunchtime.
Now, Nick, I think they've sorted that out since then, but will they really resolve this by Christmas, as they say they will?
I think they have to. I don't think they can allow this to sort of drag on for too long, because they have to, apart from anything else, give some signals to Indonesia about what's going to happen with the trade deal. So they can't afford to let it sit there, but they have to come up with, you know, a formula that tries to please everybody, which really, in the end, I don't think they'll be able to manage either.
It's a brute of an issue.
Well, Scott Morrison goes to the G20 in Argentina later this week. So he meets Donald Trump in Buenos Aires. Well, that's the expectation, that they'll have a bilateral meeting. So he won't want to make yet another, statement on this issue before then. But I think it can't come soon enough to settle.
He might be inclined to
that.
boast about it to Donald Trump and say, I'm with you on that embassy issue in Israel.
He could be, in which case he has to lock it in. And there are already people within the Liberals who say that because there's this pressure from Indonesia, Malaysia and so forth, that they can't back down. Now, that means that they've got to lock it in some ways. Christopher Pyne has a formulation that could very well be, about the two-state solution, about an embassy in the West and an embassy in the East. There is talk about a scenario where you put a token, a nameplate on a building, but in reality, all the Australian resources would still be in Tel Aviv.
But that's farcical, isn't it? Because that means you don't really make a decision.
But
right?
Haven't they got themselves into a position where it's a nightmare whichever way
they'll take farcical at this point. In terms of a resolution, it's tough. It's a tough one. Yeah. Now, Parliament sits tomorrow, and one of the first issues I think that will arise is the question of the National Integrity Commission. 33 judges have signed a letter supporting such a proposition, and that gets a run in the newspapers today as a High Court judge on the thing. And again, this is gaining strength. And again, it's a kind of an issue where the coalition has resisted it, but they might resist it to the point where they can no longer resist.
It reminds me of the Banking Royal Commission, which we saw about a year ago when Barnaby Joyce was trying to recontest his seat, and we had Nationals threatening to cross the floor everywhere. And fast forward a year, and you're in minority government, and it's something they're ultimately going to be dragged to kicking and screaming. And we saw when that was announced, the Banking Royal Commission, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison, they didn't want to be there, they didn't want to be announcing it, and they need to avoid that. They need to own this if they are going to do it, and do it on their terms, not have that sort of terrible optics of being dragged there because you're going to lose your majority in Parliament.
Bill Shorten has had this to say on that issue.
Mr Morrison about an anti-corruption commission. Mind you, I wrote to Mr Turnbull, didn't get much mail back from him. I think that Mr Morrison, if he wants to be a genuinely new broom, I mean, I know he was the Treasurer under Mr Turnbull, but if he wants to genuinely be the new broom he says he is, I think a very good development would be supporting an anti-corruption commission.
I think they'll be lining up to see who gets in first on this too, won't they? Because Cathy McGowan's got something going. The Greens have already got something through the Senate, and they want the thing voted on by midday tomorrow.
And if you engage in the discussion about how it's about setting one up, you have a bigger say over the scope of the commission. And I think that is actually the really interesting question. How big would its powers be? Would it be like the New South Wales ICAC, where you do get a lot of controversy about some of its findings when people don't actually get convicted? One of the interesting ideas in the Cathy McGowan bill is a parliamentary commission, I think alongside the Integrity Commission, but it would have more oversight of MPs and their expenses. And I think we've all seen cases where there is an argument for that. If the federal government was open to something, then they could have you could have a debate about the scope of the thing.
The government's argument, or at least some in government argue, and Paul Kelly was arguing this in the Oz, that the problem with these sorts of organisations is they end up going over the top.
Well, I think that's the New South Wales example. There are concerns about how far it would go. One thing I thought was interesting in the Cathy McGowan bill is there's talk about it applying the Prime Minister's Code of Conduct for ministers. Now, my understanding of the Prime Minister's Code of Conduct is it's pretty much written by the Prime Minister. So if you have an anti-corruption commission that then applies that template, I mean, with Malcolm Turnbull and the bonk ban, he wrote that into the Code of Conduct. So you've got a lot of discretion to add things into the Code of Conduct that then you'd have an anti-corruption commission enforcing. Wouldn't you want a few more checks and balances on what they're enforcing?
And the anti-terrorism measures that Peter Dutton now wants through the Parliament in the next 2 weeks. There's a bit of a delay because the committee is still dealing with aspects of this, so that'll take 3 days or so. But do you get the feeling that in the end Labor will fall in line with this? They don't want that issue. They don't want a conflict on this in the lead up to Christmas.
You wouldn't think so. So I think it'd be in their interest to try and, make a few tweaks and changes here and there and basically get it off the agenda. That is clearly a government issue, a government strength. I don't think they'd be wanting to spend too much time debating that. Now, the Roseville branch of the Liberal Party took a motion this week, took a decision that Malcolm Turnbull has not only lost the Prime Ministership but should be expelled from the party. One Liberal in particular thought that was a bit rich.
I think it would be a pretty radical thing for a political party to no longer want someone who had until very recently led it. And I'm not normally in support of radical things, but it is certainly the duty of all Liberals to work for and not against Liberal candidates. Malcolm gave me plenty of support in Warringah last time, and if he's going to get involved at all, that's what I'd be hoping for this time.
Well, based on his Instagram account, he's following a mob called Vote Tony Out, and interestingly, his wife and his son are following exactly the same account. That would suggest that he doesn't want you in Parliament whatsoever.
Well, maybe he's just keeping an eye on them so that he can help me more effectively.
It's very generous of Tony Abbott to take that interpretation.
Well, I'm sure. But look, there were members of the Warrnambool branch in Victoria who wanted Abbott expelled a year ago. They passed that motion. So, what goes around comes around, I guess. But Julie Bishop was out there helping in Warringah yesterday. She did a fundraiser at the Manly FEC, which was very generous on her part, I thought.
We won't see Malcolm Turnbull in Warringah. Even though
wouldn't have he did robocalls apparently in the 2016 campaign. I don't think they should be expecting those robocalls this time.
Yeah. Now, Warren Mundine, former president of the Labor Party, is now apparently tossing around in his own mind about what he should do next. He could either run as the Liberal member, the Liberal candidate in Gilmore, even though he lives in Sydney, and we're talking about a country seat here, or he might run for the Liberal Democrats for the Senate, though I think that'll be a short-term thing, given that David Leyonhjelm's term is up sometime next year. I mean, really, has politics become so flexible now that you can just sort of decide where you need a candidate and pluck somebody out of Sydney and put them in the bush?
I think this goes down to authenticity. We keep hearing voters they crave authenticity, and it comes after Mark Latham, of course, the former Labor leader, now fronting up for One Nation and likely to win that seat. So I just don't, even though Mark Latham might win, Gilmore's a very marginal seat, and to think that this would work, although he's got the profile, it comes down to, an issue of authenticity and what he actually stands for.
Well, if he can't make up his mind between, the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats, and he's debating it in public, I think it's problematic, isn't it?
Especially coming from somebody who once led the Labor Party.
Yeah.
He was the president of the Labor Party.
All bases covered.
Well, he was, as up to, I think, the Friday of the previous week, he was lining up to be the Liberal Democrat candidate, and the Liberal Party option in Gilmore came up later. My hunch is that he'll end up being the Liberal Democrat Party candidate for the Senate. Either option, it's pretty tough for him. Bad odds for him, I think, on either front.
All right, talking pictures coming up shortly. But Pamela Anderson is a great supporter of Julian Assange. She's been putting the weights on this government. Apparently she's doing television tonight into Australia to push the case for Julian Assange. When Scott Morrison heard of this, he went on Hot Tomato FM. You're all familiar with Hot Tomato FM. He went on there and had this to say.
I've had plenty of mates have asked me if they could be my special envoy to sort the issue out with Pamela Anderson.
I think the Prime Minister probably regrets the comments that he made, and I certainly know from a discussion that he didn't mean to cause any offence.
Do you think it warranted a rebuke, given what he had to say, or was it?
Well, Kelly...
It was a bit over the top, really. I mean, Pamela Anderson got what she wanted, which was a lot of publicity for herself and for Assange. So, I wouldn't have been complaining too loudly if I was her.
And this is the risk of going on FM radio, which the Prime Minister is doing every day.
Yeah.
You're going to get these questions. Bill Shorten had one about, I think, visiting a strip club in the 2016 election. You go on these programs and these are the questions you get asked.
But Kelly O'Dwyer is the Minister for Women, so I think she would have felt obliged to make the point there about the treatment of women. But, it was a relatively small thing. But, FM radio, it's a danger zone, isn't it?
But the treatment of women, too, is an issue, particularly in Victoria. And Liberals were telling me that they felt they were hurt by that, the Julia Banks experience and so on. And so I'm sure Kelly O'Dwyer would be very conscious of that, particularly as a Victorian. All right, our panel, Nikki Sama, David Crowe and Hanneke Smethurst will be back shortly with final observations. But it's time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowles and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with fellow Guardian Easter and beret wearer, the lovely Amy Ramikis, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you, always thrilled to be here.
Amy, the PM prides himself on having stopped the boats. He has a little statue in his office, and he's kind of hoping that slowing immigration will boost his votes.
Well, if you don't stop the boats, you can at least say you've slowed the boats.
Slowed the boats.
It's because migrants are slowing down the cars.
Yeah, well, that's what's happening here. And Kathy Wilcox, some asterisks of you are causing congestion, just saying.
Yeah.
Authorised by Scott Morrison.
Some, not pointing fingers, migrants.
Yeah. Are you on this? They're filling the schools. They're filling the highways.
Yeah, the people who we've invited to this country are actually using our services. Who'd have thunk it? Those awful, awful people.
Lovely David Pope.
So where the bloody hell were you?
Yeah. The roads are closed, the buses are full, the schools aren't taking any more enrolments.
You can't say, I'm going to have a bus drive around Queensland and then complain to people that the buses are full. Well, yours wasn't, it was empty.
Amy, bashing the banks is truly a victimless crime, and who isn't on Rowena Orr's cheer squad? Anyone that's actually sat there and had to get a loan, it's like, go Rowena, go Rowena.
Yeah, it's not exactly like anyone's got the violins out for Australia's biggest banks. Oh, you did badly. Oh, we lost our house, but we feel really sorry for how contrite you are right now.
Lovely John Kadelka.
Temper your sense of justice, you who enter here.
We should probably have taken that down. If you wrote this in a book, some of the things they got up to, you'd say, well, that's just never going to happen. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that everyone who has ever dealt with a big bank over something slightly complicated knew exactly what they were capable of.
Amy, it's like the Liberal Party have had this horrible bust up and repartnered, and then they're looking over at the old partner going, damn him, he's getting on with his life.
How dare he go on without us?
They're going insane, right?
Yeah,
every time he does something. Look, he's followed someone on Instagram.
He's moved on with his life, but he's moved on too soon. Where is the sitting and the crying and the eating ice cream in a darkened room?
I know, and watching Love Actually, I wonder what happens if I follow this Instagram account. And this is beautiful.
And I just love, just the serenity of this scene. Just the little, just going to, just a little.
This is a lovely Mark David from Independent Australia cartoon, Liberal Party Fight Night. The first rule of Liberal Party Fight Night is tell everyone about Liberal Party.
Tell absolutely everyone. Tell everyone before it happens, live tweet it as it's happening, and then change your story about why it happened immediately after.
And then go on Sky and justify the fight.
Yeah, we'll just say that the fight didn't happen.
Yeah. Sorry, people, only two in a ring at a time. As if the Liberal Party needed any more evidence that they thought the NEG was a Labor policy, and Labor Party's picked it up.
It is exactly a Labor policy
We
now.
knew it!
This is the ultimate troll, isn't it, though? Like taking the policy that broke the Liberal Party apart and then claiming it as your own and then asking the Liberal Party to vote for it.
Hey, that's our energy policy.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now it's a renewable.
Matt Golding, he sees the shorteners driving around at the council clean-up, picking up the old discarded parts of the Liberal Party.
Too hard rubbish collection.
Amy, this year we formalised the Talking Pictures Cartoon of the Year, and you can get online and have a look at our shortlist and vote for it right here. So get on there. And one of the people you'll find there is the wonderful John Kudelka, who won the Walkley for artwork and cartoon. And congratulations to him. He had a great year.
He did. All of our cartoonists had a great year.
Yes, they have.
With such little material.
Barry's had a very late night working on the election, so you might have to speak up.
Back to you, Barry.
I'm still with it. We can't go the whole program without playing at least part of David Spear's interview with the Liberal candidate in Frankston, Michael Lamb, who is insisting that the Liberals have a very different policy on coal-fired power stations to Labor.
We'll tender to the Senate, whatever the market decides.
Well, they can do that already, though, can't they?
Who's that?
The private sector can build a power station if they want.
Whatever is the most reliable and affordable, the market will determine that.
And that's what I'm saying. The market determines that every day, don't they?
Yeah,
what are you saying you do differently?
Well, the tender process will be building a power station.
A tender process for what? For the government?
The lowest base power, yeah.
So the government, the taxpayer would fund this
No,
power
it's
station.
private industry.
But they can do that already.
Well, they haven't. All my understanding of it is that we will tender to get private industry to build a power station.
OK, with a bit of help from the state, presumably.
Yes.
So a bit of taxpayers' money.
Yes.
Right. Because you earlier said it wouldn't be.
Sorry.
OK.
He did say sorry. Final observation?
And he didn't win yesterday, so I don't know how much that interview played in. The seat of Lindsay, I've got a story today speaking to Emma Hussar. She has made it very clear to both Bill Shorten and Labor bosses she wants to stay in that seat and run. My understanding is that after the 2 sitting weeks, they might just plant somebody in there. They haven't officially opened pre-selections, but she's getting in first to make it clear she doesn't want to go anywhere.
Wow. How will that end?
I think the timing will be key.
David?
We've talked about women in the Liberal Party and the New South Wales Senate pre-selection. The message from the mainstream Conservatives, which they texted to everybody on Saturday in that pre-selection, was a list of who to vote for. They put 3 women on the ticket last on their list. And I got a text from a Conservative woman saying, wouldn't you think it rather stupid for someone to send a text recommending putting 3 women last? I think the verdict is in on that.
Nikki?
So more on pre-selections. I think we should keep an eye on Julia Banks and what she might or might not do in the next little while. And also the other contentious pre-selection that remains to be resolved is Craig Kelly's in the seat of Hughes. My information is that's been delayed until February next year because it looks for certain that he's going to lose his pre-selection, and Morrison is very worried that he would then go and sit on the crossbenches. So they're trying to put it off.
Very brief, do you think Julia Banks could win as an independent?
Depends where she runs.
Oh, interesting. All right, well, we'll leave you with the final word on the Victorian election from Matters Health. Thanks for watching.
And finally, a Greens candidate in the upcoming Victorian election has been forced to withdraw simply for posting online that she was hungover as late for work, wearing no underpants and stinking of the weed in her bag. And that made her unsuitable for the Greens. Goodbye.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.